production, it doesn't go the way we want it, then I'm okay with that.
Amen.
So I started the recording. So I'm just going to pause for about 10 seconds and then we'll start. Good evening, Peggy.
Good evening, Jerome.
How are you doing this evening?
I'm fine, thank you, and delighted to be here.
So Peggy, thank you for participating in the 1960s project. The 1960s project is a platform to hear the voices of those who were in high school in the 1960s. And what years were you in high school in the 1960s?
From 1962 until 1966.
And where did you go to high school?
I went to the Philadelphia High School for Girls, more popularly known as Girls High.
And would that be Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, or Philadelphia, Mississippi?
That would be Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Broad and Olney.
Okay. And you, prior to high school, where did you go to school?
I began my schooling, well, I'll even go back a step. As a toddler, I'll say, I was in nursery school. And as I approached the age for kindergarten, my mother thought it would be okay that I not go to kindergarten, but go straight into first grade. But then she thought about it and wondered if I were prepared. And a friend of hers who taught first grade was asked to just spend some time with me, maybe kind of make sure I was okay for first grade. And she said, Peggy's fine, don't worry about it. So I started first grade at the Charles Richard Drew School in West Philadelphia.
I take it your family lived in West Philadelphia at that time?
Yes, we did. We lived on Hamilton Street in what is now Powelton Village.
Okay. Was Powelton Village relatively new then, or was it an established community?
It was probably an established community that got established differently years later. We happened to live in a large house that had been broken up into apartments. But years later, I knew a Drexel student who actually had a room down the street that he was renting to go to school at Drexel. And by that time, a number of professors from Drexel, Penn, Temple had bought the entire properties along Hamilton Street. So they went back to being large homes, some of them broken up still to have rooms to let, but many of them were the full family home that they had begun to be. It was a beautiful neighborhood.
Was it segregated or integrated?
It was integrated. And I say that because even as a little girl, I know I went to Sunday school at a church right at the corner. It was pretty much all white, except for neighbors who happened to be Black who went. And one thing that stands out in my mind, now you're getting me to really reminisce, there was a presentation to the pastor, and it was made by John Facenda. And everybody knew John Facenda, if not by voice, then by his appearance. And even as a little girl, I remember being very impressed that I was seeing the man that's on TV every night.
And if I believe he was like on Channel 9 or something?
10, or well,
Channel 10?
it was 3 then?
No,
I forget
maybe
the
3.
change. It was 3, WCAU. The
WCAU.
bulletin station.
Yes, I hadn't heard that name in, wow, 50 years.
Yes,
John Facenda. I can almost hear his voice resonating
it
in
was
my
wonderful.
head. I should let the audience know that I graduated from Germantown High School in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And I graduated in the year of 1965. And so just to put some context, I may not, since we were chatting before we got started, let me step back and introduce myself, say who I am. I'm Jerome Page, and we have a platform on the web called What's on Jerome's Mind. And the 1960s project is one of the programs of the What's on Jerome's Mind. So you can Google us and check out our broadcast and also our blogs. So you're talking about John Facenda. And so do you remember what the pastor said?
He was I know he expressed delight in being presented, whatever the citation or whatever it was, by John Facenda. And I'm sure there was some commentary about the news and how familiar he was to the Philadelphia community because of his news broadcasts. And as a child, I probably didn't get much more out of it, at least not that I remember.
So did you grow up in Powelton Village?
I lived there until I was 7. My family moved at that point to Mount Airy, otherwise oftentimes called Germantown, but we moved to the unit block of Montana Street off of Germantown Avenue. And we moved just in time for me to begin 2nd grade. So at that point, I was enrolled at Eleanor Cope Emlyn School.
And our family lived right across the street, almost from Eleanor Copeland Emlyn Street. We
Oh
were
my,
on Upsall Street, I think it
Upsall,
was.
yes.
We're right at Upsall. We have a question for Faye. Faye, you want to turn your mic on and ask a question?
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I too, wait a minute. Am I okay? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I was just going to say, I'm also a proud graduate of Emlyn Elementary School.
Well, there you go. See? Small world.
And I'm a graduate of Emlyn as well. So we could have an Emlyn alumni meeting right up in here.
Yes.
What was the impetus for your family to move from West Philadelphia to Mount Airy?
Just the whole success of owning a home instead of living in an apartment, moving to a neighborhood that was up and coming, a lot more diversity even at that time, better schools, the kinds of things that many families would relocate for. But I know it was really exciting for me as a 7-year-old, first of all, to have a backyard and a front yard. But what got my attention most, I recall, was having a porch that had an awning. And that awning was something that I'll just always remember, a green striped awning that was just part of my memories from that time in my life.
The awnings were popular
Yes.
accessory to houses up in Germantown, Mount Airy area,
Mm-hmm.
Mount Airy area of the city. What was up and coming? What types of occupations were your mother? What type of jobs did your mother hold? What types of jobs did your father hold?
Okay. They were both employed by the government. They were at the Veterans Administration at 5000 Wissahickon Avenue. Actually, it was my stepfather and my mother that caused us to move. My mother had been married previously to my biological father, but they divorced when I was quite young. But as I think about it, perhaps my mother met my stepfather at the VA after she was divorced. So they both were with the government.
And do you know what types of duties they had at the VA?
I know I visited several times, and I believe it had a lot to do with veterans insurance policies and their GI bills, a lot of the clerical work that was needed to support our vets.
What do you remember about being at Emlyn, Eleanor Cope Emlyn School?
Yes. I remember
That's an elementary school.
Okay, I remember the schoolyard. That was a place that certainly at recess, there were certain little groups that got together. We played games. There was a sloping side of that schoolyard, as I recall. It was just a slope, and somehow we were over there rolling things down, whatever. I also remember in the school buildings, there was a portion of the building called the wing. And those were the classrooms that, in fact, I went through 3 of them with. My first teacher was Mrs. Felder. I want to say she was in room 16. That may not be correct, but these were double-digit numbers on the rooms. My 3rd grade teacher was Mrs. Unthank, and my 4th grade teacher was Mrs. Booth, but they were all located in that part of the building, not the main building, but the wing.
Okay. As you were talking, and images of being in that schoolyard flashed in my mind. So
There you go.
you triggering a lot of stuff up in here.
Okay.
I
Happy to
remember
do
we
that.
used to have the May Day celebrations,
Yes.
and I got bit by a dog during one
I
of
was
those
gonna say
celebrations.
it was a dog show too, wasn't it? And
Maybe that was where I got bit.
it
It was
was
the
the
dog
dog
show.
show. And my father would bring our dog and we'd go around the circle. I don't think my dog ever got a prize, but it was fun just being able to have your dog at school.
Yeah, maybe that's where I got bit. That was the first. That was the first time I got bit by a dog. I
Uh-oh,
got bit again, but that was more. That was later in life.
oh my
So,
goodness.
uh, so if what about if you move on to junior high school? What was your transition from elementary school to junior high school?
By that time, there was a tendency of more disruption, change in our neighborhood. And I was aware of, but I didn't talk about it much, a gang that kind of roamed the streets between my block on Montana Street and Sharpnack and then at the school. And I don't think anything serious happened to me, but one time they did stop me. And these were boys, but probably sixth, seventh, eighth grade age. And of course, I was really intimidated being a second or third grader. And my mother and father decided that perhaps there would be a school, another school that I could go to. At that time, you could apply to schools outside of your neighborhood.
And did your parents apply to a school outside the neighborhood?
They did several, Houston, and I know Jinx because I ended up going to Jinx in Chestnut Hill. And that was again for fifth grade. This happened the first week of school in fifth grade.
What was junior high school like?
Going to a school that went from kindergarten to eighth, I guess it wasn't the typical junior high experience, but there was something special about being able to stay in the same school from fifth grade and this move up a floor to go to seventh and eighth grade. There was that hierarchy, the older kids versus the little kids, but we did have interactive activities that sometimes we'd read to the children that were in the lower grades. A number of my classmates had begun at Jenks. They started in kindergarten. So now I was joining their class in fifth grade.
And what was the racial composition of Jinx?
Predominantly white. There were enough Black students that I believe it was a new presence to that area, perhaps based on where one lived. That area still was pretty much white and very middle class, if not upper middle class. We meaning students outside of that neighborhood, mainly the Black students, we took PTC, the public transportation, to get to school. I was able to get the 23 trolley and ride straight down Germantown or up Germantown Avenue to Chestnut Hill, and the trolley stopped right across the street from the school.
I'm very familiar with the 23 trolley line.
Yeah.
My family, we grew up mainly right at Germantown Avenue and Tupperhocken Street.
Okay, yes.
So we were on the 23 trolley that was our main way to travel, particularly if we're going downtown or
Yes,
like you say,
10th
up
and
to.
Igor. I remember the stops at either end. And to get to Jenks, though, you had to be sure to get on the Bethlehem Pike line. I mean, they were the same line, but one turned at Gorgas Lane, one trolley turned at Mermaid Lane, and the other one went all the way up to Bethlehem Pike, and that got you to Jenks.
What type of educational or social activities did you engage in at Jinx?
I was in the Girl Scouts at my church. Goodness, why am I not remembering? I think as young girls, we were always forming clubs. We had a Nancy Drew book club, and I can remember meetings at my house and somebody else's house. Roller skating. Roller skating became a great pastime that my family participated in. That was a time when organizations gave skating parties and entire families participated. My Girl Scout troop actually took roller skating to earn a badge. We earned a badge together.
And
And I
you're referring to roller skating in a rink,
A
a
rink,
rink.
rink roller skating, yes. And also I did it out in the street too with the key, but no, these were shoe skates for roller skating. And maybe you know Linda Brown Bagley.
Yes. Hmm.
She and I were partners and we had a dance routine on skates. And whenever I see her now, the first thing we say are the steps to that dance routine, and then we fall out laughing.
Okay. You mentioned the Girl Scouts and being at the church.
Yes.
How was what type of church did you attend, and what was your church life like?
Okay. I attended Holy Cross Lutheran Church. At that time, it was at Cliveden and Magnolia Street. I certainly went to Sunday school. And then also, as I got a little older, I did stay for church. My mother was in the choir. My stepfather was a rather reluctant attendee. I can't say that he went that often, but he did go through the original new member training and all.
Was the congregation black or white?
It was predominantly Black, maybe one or two white attendees, yes.
Are there any memorable fact things about Jinx that stand out?
I think there was something about the idea of being in Chestnut Hill that, in my mind, had a little bit of status. There were a lot of lovely shops, some of them are still there, and just the diversity of students there. We took wonderful trips. I know in sixth grade, I got to see A Midsummer Night's Dream down at the Forest Theater. We had taken the train to see that. Um, Other excursions and just the way we were part of that neighborhood, that whole area.
But you live somewhere else. You said you
I
took.
lived about, and I figured it out. I don't remember the mileage, but if you would drive or take the trolley straight down Germantown Avenue, you pretty much quickly got to Montana Street
Yeah.
next to Horter, between Horter and Sharpnack. Um, I'm sure it's probably more than 5 miles, but it was an adjacent neighborhood.
Okay, and was your neighborhood the neighborhood where you lived in predominantly white or predominantly black?
It was predominantly Black. It was changing, as were many neighbors. I know our house was purchased from a white family. White flight was happening.
And you left junior high school, and where did you attend next?
I then went to Girls High,
Because it started.
storied Girls High, and I knew about Girls High. Two of my mother's dearest friends were at Girls High, and I've heard from one of them. They would have been in their 90s now. One is still living. And she said, you know, of the three of us, your mother should have been at Girls High. But my mother had thoughts about career and marriage, and she just did not want to apply herself to go to Girls High. She went to William Penn High School, but I think it was really special for her that I went.
You started high school at what grade?
Ninth grade. So I
Ninth
had
grade.
4 full years at Girls High.
Okay. And what was the racial composition of Girls High?
At that time, as it turned out, I found there were far more Black students than I would have anticipated. There was a very large Jewish component at Girls High. And then I want to say maybe 50% Black. I may be really wrong in that estimation. But over the years, a lot of us have gotten together. We call ourselves the sisters of the 210. And we've shared things. There was some pain through a number of young ladies' experience going through Girls High. The fact that their academic achievement was not considered as likely as other students. And they were discouraged from pursuing college
Can you
or
before you go on,
Sure.
can you tell us what the 210 is?
At Girls High and also at Central High School for men, there is, boys, let me say that to keep it equal, the fact that each class is numbered according to your order of classes. And early on, there were 2 graduations a year. So there'd be 2 numbers for that year. But all the way back from 1848, when the school was founded, each class had a number. And by the time it got to 1962, it was up to 210 classes that were at Girls High. And it's our immediate way of identifying one another. If you say your class number, you can almost figure out immediately what years that person was there. And it's the same for Central.
Judy, are you trying to say something?
I was going to say something. As Peggy knows, and she learned earlier, I'm a Girls High graduate. I was in the 201st graduating class. It was a June class. I think that was my number. I shouldn't forget. But in any event, I'm really curious, not curious, so I guess I understand your comments about the reception or perception of African-American girls, Black girls in girls' high school. Though I graduated some years before you, my experience was pretty much the same in terms of not being that encouraged to think about college or only think about certain colleges. And so I was particularly interested in hearing you say that. And I do remember from reading your essay that there was some later discouragement in terms of, where you wanted to go to college or going to college, having to do with the SAT scores. I found out that the vice principal who gave us our SAT scores and never came directly to the student at that time, actually indicated to me that I had a much lower score than I actually had. And she suggested that I go to Cheney College rather than the predominantly white college I was initially interested in. I ended up at Howard University like you, and that was the best decision I ever made. But anyway, I'll stop there.
No, but thank you. And that was a component of a lot of people's memories, a lot of Black students' memories. They didn't have good feelings about Girls High. And at the time we were there, it was the same kind of activity, though, coming from faculty, but it was our counselor that did so much damage. And the counselors were assigned by your last name. So just depending on who you had, there was that tendency to discourage your going forward. And for the most part, ladies just ignored it and did what they felt was best or what their families felt best. And that is how I got to Howard. I had been recommended to go to Mount Holyoke and Connecticut College for Women. And all I could think of was 4 years of all girls at Girls High was quite enough. I needed to hear more about my people to get myself out there. And I can think of no better place than Howard to do that. So I didn't even want to waste my parents' money by applying to the other schools. I only applied to Howard. And by October of my senior year, I was accepted.
Peggy, Arrow has a question.
You mentioned that your high school was so large that you had 2 classes, and I'm wondering how many students attended Girls High each year.
And actually, it wasn't the 2, and I'll go back to that. My graduating class in 1996 was just shy of 500. I think over the years that the class sizes were getting bigger, but I'm not sure exactly the whole school number. And even now, that number has started to decrease. There are a lot of reasons for that. One of them was the fact that girls could be admitted to the boys' school down the street, Central, and many of them opted for Central as opposed to Girls High. That happened in the 80s. But the fact that we had 2 classes a year was the fact that Philadelphia was on the A and B system, that depending on your birthday, you began school in September, and that was the A class, and you graduated in June after that, or you began school in February. Those born, I guess, in November, December, they would have missed the September cutoff, but they had the cutoff that was later in the year, and they became the classes that graduated the next January. Not the next January, but when it was graduation time. So there were 2 graduating classes per year. For a number of years, it didn't end until, goodness, maybe in the early 60s.
I thought I heard you said 1998 or 1996. Was that a mistake? you referring to
Yeah,
class
it
of
was
64?
it was
Okay.
later, if I may interrupt briefly, the two class system went through at least your class, and maybe in the early 70s or early 80s, they went to the one class per year, I
Can I
think.
say actually, and
Mhm.
not, and I could definitely check this.
Mhm.
I recall that it ended when I was 10, when I was in 5th grade, because that year
Oh,
in 1958, Masterman opened, and a number of my classmates were chosen to go to Masterman. And I believe they had been in the B part of my
right.
class. They got skipped. They skipped 5th grade and went to 6th grade. So
Yeah,
that was much earlier.
you're absolutely right, and I'm thinking about my college dates, not my high school dates. I started girls high in 57 and
Okay.
finished in 61. Sorry.
No, that's okay. Good
Peggy,
information.
what was academic and social life for you like at Girls High?
It was pretty much all academic. There was certainly the emphasis on learning, on what women could do if we applied ourselves and determined to overcome whatever barriers had been set up. And I'm sure they were talking more about gender than race, but we were encouraged as young women to pursue academics. It was a competitive environment. A lot of young ladies were, it just seemed like brilliant, 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 brilliant. Their grades and their scores on SATs, there was something special about the kind of academics that went on there. Socially, it was kind of interesting whether or not you knew guys at Central, or in my case, it dawned on me, what were you doing? This seems to be contrived. Just about all my close girlfriends had older brothers. So that made for some interesting gatherings at their homes when we just knew that these older brothers and their friends, many of them from Central, would be there. So I wasn't dating, I was very shy, I was very quiet, but it was fun just to hang out with these older guys. They treated us like, you know, their younger sister's friend, pats on the head, that kind of thing. But as far as I was concerned, that was okay.
Was there much social interaction with students outside the school, or was you went to school and you interacted with kids at school and then you returned to your neighborhood and had the social engagement there?
I think there was more of outside of school, sticking with your friends that were in your neighborhood that you'd grown up with. And it was, I think, more obvious among my Jewish classmates. They really had tight bonds outside of Girls High and inside Girls High.
What types of clubs did you join in at Girls High?
I remember as a 9th grader, the first club that I joined was the short story club. I have no idea why I got into it. And I happened to have a very interesting teacher who was my English teacher. Um, she was just very open and very expressive about what literature was expressing. And so we're reading short stories by Ibsen and O. Henry, and probably a little over my head, but she always read into it something. Even when we read mythology, she said, just listen to that, the moist. So, I mean, it was kind of like, woo. So that was my awakening from being naive. But
I always found Isbin to be very dark and very
and it was that kind of,
tragic.
it was the kind of thing that maybe I would have appreciated more in 10th or 11th grade, but 9th grade, it was, ooh, what is this? But I learned.
And the one short story by O. Henry that I remember is the Christmas story, which
Yes, the Magi, the gift of the
the
Magi.
gift of the Magi, which gets
Yes,
repeated every year.
absolutely.
Yeah, so
I also was in the French club, and I'm not sure about too many others, but yeah, there was the clubs, and we had a different bell schedule on days that for club. We did our last period first, and then ended up going to club in our last period, something like that.
okay. When you say bell period, the bells what do you mean there?
Bells would ring when it was time to change classes, and there was a certain schedule for different days. Some of them, I guess it would be like the Thursday schedule. It would be announced early in the day for whatever reason, if it would be a different schedule than usual. But the club schedule, I remember.
I would remind folks if they have questions, they can also drop them in the chat box, and I'll be monitoring that as we go along as well. Well, how did you decide on Howard to go to Howard University?
A number of reasons. Friends of my mother's had gone to Howard. One had gone to Morgan, but she forgave me and said, "Okay, let's talk about Howard." There were several of my girlfriend's older brothers who actually went to Howard. That figured heavily into it. One got me a Howard hat when I was a junior at Girls High, and oh, I wore that to death. He couldn't tell me I wasn't already at Howard. But knowing the history of Howard, who had attended, what it meant to the world, really, but certainly the African American community, and an opportunity to go to that school was something that I was really proud of.
David asked the question of what year did you start Howard?
I started Howard in the fall of '66.
And I believe that's the same year that David started Howard.
And I read that, and I thought, just as I had not met you at Howard, I don't recall meeting David. I lived in Wheatley Hall.
I started in the fall of '66.
Yes. You remember freshman assembly?
Absolutely.
When Trudy Haynes spoke to us from Philadelphia. She was from the Channel 3, I believe, or NBC News.
Well, now that you mention it, that is coming back to me.
Yes.
What I remember most about freshman assembly was that I hated Dean Snow.
Yes, he spoke a lot with his very eloquent, lofty, whatever. But it counted against you if you didn't show up for freshman assembly.
Oh, there were seniors taking freshman assembly.
There you go. It was something you had to complete to graduate.
What did you major in at Howard?
Zoology.
Ooh, wait a minute.
Oh, okay. All right.
Zoology. First of all, for those who might not know, what is zoology and what does a zoologist do?
Well, zoology is the study of animals, not to be confused with biology, which is the study of plants and animals. Botany is all plants, zoology is animals. It's usually considered the pre-med track at most colleges. And for whatever reason, I was adamantly opposed to going to med school. And it's something that I'm sorry I did that to myself for a lot of reasons. But I have a son who's a doctor, so that helps.
Was your major in science? So you took zoology
I did
as a
zoology
freshman?
major and allied sciences minor. So I had to take a lot of chemistry, physics. When I went to graduate school, I ended up having to make up some courses like physical chemistry, crazy stuff.
Your life, your career, then, I mean, your education was around science. But before you answer that question, Aero has another question she'd like to ask.
Yes, when I read your essay, I was wondering, what did you do with your zoology degree and what did you go ahead on to become professionally?
And forgive me, I ended very suddenly because I was exhausted from writing so much about my childhood. Anyway, when I graduated from Howard, I was awarded a fellowship to Bryn Mawr College. And that was something that at one point it interfered with my thinking, I'll put it that way, though it was a wonderful opportunity and I'm happy I did it. I interviewed for a slot in a PhD program in pathology at New York University. But before I had my interview, I was escorted to a room where an African-American female MD was seated. We chatted and she wanted to know why I was not applying for medical school. And it got to the point that I was offered admission to NYU's medical school, no questions asked. I didn't have to take the MedCats, which I had not taken. I took the graduate record exam. And they were really adamant about having me go to med school. And I was equally adamant about not filling their quota and doing what I wanted to do. So
And what did you end up
So what
doing?
did you do?
I ended up going to Bryn Mawr. I got a master's degree in biochemistry. The first year out of Bryn Mawr, I was able to work at Children's Hospital in a hematology program that was looking at sickle cell anemia, which at that time was very popular, well funded, very much needed in the Black community because sickle cell is a biochemical disease, put it that way.
And you said that Children's Hospital, was that in Philadelphia?
Yes, CHOP,
CHOP?
Children's Hospital of Philadelphia.
Okay.
So would you say that you became a researcher?
I did.
Okay. And was that your full career?
After Children's Hospital, when I realized how there was a lot more money in other industries, because I was almost embarrassed oftentimes when relatives, other friends who had a high school education were being paid more than I was paid at Children's Hospital. In addition to the fact that the money for sickle cell anemia started running out and they got into other diseases, Tay-Sachs disease that affects the Jewish community. So I applied to the pharmaceutical industry and I worked for a number of pharmaceutical companies throughout my career, 35 years until I retired 6 years ago.
Were you a researcher at the pharmaceutical
I
companies?
started in research, but once you get into companies, depending on the company, I was at Merck. The whole idea is to get out of the lab because unless you have a PhD, you're not going to get recognized for too much. And to get into a desk job, which I did, it was regulatory affairs. And those are the groups that interact with the FDA and other countries' health agencies on the approval of drugs, the prescribing information that's written for drugs, a lot of contact with people throughout the company. I enjoyed that because you had to work with doctors, lawyers, the works to get that package insert written.
I believe it's Ken Frazier that's head of Merck now. Is that
Yes,
correct?
he is. And
And so was he there at the time that you were there? And did you
he
have an
had
opportunity to
just
get to know
begun
him?
as a lawyer at Merck. He was new to the committee that included lawyers, doctors, drug experienced people. We met once a week to talk about what was going into the prescribing information, and it had to be approved legally, clinically, all that. It was Thursday, we had this meeting. One Thursday, it was snowing heavily, and especially in Mount Airy where Ken lived. And I don't know how many people know that Mount Airy is pretty highly elevated and it often gets more snow than the rest of the city. He wasn't able to get to Merck out in West Point. I don't know how. I got in touch with the administrative assistant. We actually patched him into the meeting by phone. And this was in like the mid 80s when people just didn't do teleconferencing that much. And he was forever grateful that I had spared him the embarrassment of not showing up to that meeting because of snow. But yes, when I was at Merck, I was so proud of him, and hearing that he had become the president was amazing.
Mhm.
So Errol, can you
For
tell us a
our
little bit
listeners
about,
who may not, for our listeners who may not be aware, those who look at this broadcast, he's one of the few Black CEOs in corporate America.
Yes.
that was going to be my follow-up question, but thank you, Errol. Very good. As a career in the regulatory space, were there any particular drugs that you managed that you feel good about in terms of their efficacy and success in addressing the issues and the public health issues in the country?
Okay. And this goes back to the late 80s. Prilosec. I don't know how
Oh,
many of you have
yes.
taken that for extreme heartburn and gastroesophageal
Yeah.
gastroesophageal reflux disease. Okay. Prilosec was something that Merck shared the development of with a company in Sweden. And I actually got to travel to Sweden because of it. But once it was submitted as a drug application to the FDA, there was a certain reviewer there who was adamantly opposed to approving this drug. And it was a lot to do with the way the drug works to shut off the acid in the stomach, a lot of things like that. And the drug was grudgingly approved with what's called a boxed warning. Many drugs have boxed warnings, but it pretty much tells people you're going to have a problem if you take this, if this happens. This particular reviewer felt that the drug was potentially carcinogenic. And from the studies that Merck did, we couldn't prove otherwise. So the drug got approved. I want to say it was 1989. It was put on the market. Also, the fact that it was approved as the drug Losec. So here comes this new drug. It had a new mechanism of action. Everybody was excited about it. Losec was on the market. It had this huge box warning. And very shortly after that, a pharmacist misread someone's prescription. The person was being prescribed, and for some reason, I'm not going to think of the drug, but it was another drug that sounded like Losec. It began with an L. And instead of receiving that drug, the person was given Losec and the person died. It caused a big hubbub in the industry and certainly a big problem for Merck that right at that time was number one in the industry. The first thing that had to happen was to change the name of the drug. So instead of being named Losec, okay, well, the drug was Lasix that it was mixed up with and a diuretic. So Lasix was prescribed, but the person received Losec and died. A new name came out that was Prilosec. With time, Merck sold that drug to AstraZeneca, I believe, and they did further studies, and for a long enough time, that drug eventually got to take out that boxed warning, something that pretty much has never happened in the drug industry. When a drug is approved with a box warning, it usually stays there. But that's how Prilosec got to be so popular, so well used, frequently prescribed, and then it went over the counter. So it has done fantastically well since that first incident, but it was a rough road in the beginning.
Lewis has a question. Lewis, can you turn your mic on?
Yes, that sounds familiar, the name of the drug, and I wondered whether or not it was one that's advertised on TV that people litigate for lawsuits because they've had issues of illness.
At this time, I'm not familiar with any because I usually listen when a drug is advertised. Prilosec has been very successful and prescribed for so many people, and especially after it went over the counter. But I believe there are some drugs, and I one time worked for Johnson & Johnson. There are some Johnson & Johnson drugs there were a lot of lawsuits. I'm not going to think of any specific drug and what the adverse reaction was. Also, Merck came out with a drug for osteoarthritis called Vioxx. This was in the late 90s. Merck was determined to be the first on the market with that drug, but a small company in Chicago named Searle, GD Searle, got their version of that drug approved first. That was Celebrex. At the time, I was at Merck. I was taking, is that true? No, the drug didn't get approved as quickly as Celebrex, and Merck really had a fit. They did everything they could to catch up. It was not approved until 6 months later. I actually moved to Chicago to work for that company for Celebrex. And at the time, that company was the first blockbuster drug that earned over $1 billion in sales within the first 9 months. Vioxx never caught up, and then both of them were in lawsuits about people having cardiovascular reactions. But Merck never proved that that wasn't true, and Vioxx never came back on the market. Celebrex eventually did. But talking about Ken Frazier, he was the chief counsel for Merck at the time those lawsuits were coming in, and he really saved that company. And I think that certainly contributed to his becoming CEO.
Peggy, in your blog, Peggy, in your blog, you say your life was typical
That
of an
was my
African
early
American
life.
experience. I'm having trouble believing this now that I'm talking to you. Why do you think your life was typical? And did you have any struggles as being an African American female who was coming up the ranks in the pharmaceutical industry?
I did, and if I can be candid about Merck, I spent 16 years there, and it was great experience. But toward the end, and at this time I was approaching 50, I was very frustrated that I was the one training younger white women. Several of them were temporary employees. And when it came to sharing responsibility for drugs, my management was often willing to let these younger people that I'm training share in with a drug that we're working on. Merck kind of graded people and ranked people on how successfully you managed a successful drug. But if you were assigned drugs that nobody cared about, that caught up with you. And that was happening to me too. So for a number of reasons, I left Merck, and I'm sure it was racial. There were times when I was in denial, but I believe it became racial.
If people want to turn their microphones on now and ask Peggy questions, feel free to jump in. Go ahead,
So your
Louis.
answer to the racism was to leave the company rather than confront?
It is not to be disclosed what I did, but it had to do with some legalities. And I'm supposedly, after all this time, not to disclose anything from that. But yeah, there were other confrontations. There was a class action suit that really had started in the production side of the company. Very few people in research wanted to get involved, but it talked about such things as walking into the men's room and seeing a noose hanging, or having outright discrimination in pay, in hours, this sort of thing. And there was a class action suit.
Louis?
Peggy, I had a question about, you were saying the people you trained, the younger white women, what were they allowed to share in? What kind of responsibility were you alluding to?
Wow. There was a drug for migraines that Merck came out with called Maxalt. Whenever there's a new drug application being prepared, there are people like myself who were working on the prescribing information for the United States and also for other countries. When I was training this young lady, she was assigned the other countries. I had the United States because that was the most responsibility, all of the above. The drug did get approved. It's usually approved in other countries first, particularly Europe, which is how the UK has recently approved Pfizer's vaccine, but that often always happens abroad rather than the US first. In May of 1998, there was going to be an approval in Europe. The United States didn't get approved until June. I knew by March that was going to happen because Europe's on a schedule. I applied for time off and also having the responsibilities shift, that because she had started getting involved with the United States. I wanted her to keep Europe and I would keep the United States because my older son was graduating from Morehouse in May of 1998. I wanted that time off. In an act of sheer evilness, they assigned her the United States and kept me with Europe. And I still went to Atlanta, but I had to monitor what was going on with Europe to get that drug approved. And that was pretty much the last straw. I left Merck in 99.
Are there any, Faye?
Yeah, I think you mentioned a trip to Sweden. You want to tell us about that? I don't know anybody back then who was going to Sweden.
Well, okay.
And wait a minute, since you're so typical,
I had said I was.
Everybody typically goes to Sweden, right?
No. That was the early part of my life. I believe Jerome. I stand on that. It wasn't everything because a lot has happened that I'm just amazed. I could go into great detail. I feel I'm talking too much anyway. We had a joint venture with a company in Sweden, in Stockholm, that was developing Prilosec. Is that true, Peggy? It was another drug. I'm not going to remember what drug it was. But all along, when there were these joint ventures, and at that time, Merck only participated in joint ventures, there was never any discussion about a merger or a takeover, but that changed. Eventually, Merck merged with Schering-Plough. But no one from my department had ever been invited to travel to talk about any of the drug information or the prescribing information. And this was when things were starting to get really annoying to me about how much I was not permitted to do. And just for the heck of it, I said, I think labeling should go to this meeting. And I think to keep me quiet, because I was going to get louder later, they let me go to Sweden.
Wow, nice.
And it was marvelous just to travel. I was with several colleagues. We had been on the same team for this drug. I don't even remember the name of the drug, but it was my first trip abroad.
Okay.
And I was just so thrilled to have this opportunity. And we were treated like royalty there. It was in May, and the days were very long. Like it was still light out at 9:30, 10 o'clock at night. The food was wonderful. We had caviar for dinner every evening. And after the meeting ended, I guess that was from, say, Sunday through Tuesday, Thursday, Wednesday were our meetings. And then everybody was free to leave, but it was just before the Memorial Day weekend. And I wanted to stay on my own money. I found out I could take a train to Copenhagen, Denmark. And most people say, wait a minute, those countries are in the water. Yeah, but it was an 8-hour train ride that the trains were uncoupled and put on ferries to cross the waterway to go to Denmark. And here I am, bold by myself, no longer with anyone who spoke Sweden. In Sweden, I had people who spoke Swedish. Here I am, totally unaware of the language, just craziness in terms of whatever. But when I got to my hotel, they said, I'm sorry, Miss Beecham, the hotel is full. And I was about to go, but they said, we've moved you into a suite. So instead of a hotel room, I ended up in this fabulous suite. And so much else happened, but that was quite an experience. In addition to doing a presentation with the other company, and I did talk about the labeling. They needed our input.
Yeah, Clark, did you have something you wanted to ask?
I'm just totally being entertained and, enlightened by the conversation. I guess we'd like to probably know, about her husband and her children and where they met and, what that's about.
Okay, more of my.
What's your business?
Time, Jerome? I'm sorry.
You want to get in your
Well,
business.
we'll let you answer that question, and then we'll
Okay.
ask you a question around what do you see when you look back? So you can address Clark's
that's totally
question.
part of it. I could write a book, and I have said I need to write books. I actually got engaged when I was at Howard, and the engagement happened in front of my mother at Meridian Hill in the lounge, because my mother and my then fiance came to attend the wedding of a dear friend of mine. And you may know Brenda Garrison from the class of '66 at Germantown. She has since passed away. But
Okay,
we knew each other from second grade, and we knew of each other, but we didn't get together again till Howard. But she was getting married the next day. I got engaged, had a lovely ring, and at her wedding reception, I went down the line with my ring, and people were, anyway, that's a memory. But that fall, I went to Bryn Mawr, and I planned to be there maybe for a year. My fiance was from New York. I wanted to transfer to Columbia. I was accepted, but there was one other African American student in the graduate dormitory. I lived on campus. This was a gentleman who had gone to Lincoln, and out of pretty much survival mode, because Bryn Mawr was so different from Howard and Lincoln, all kinds of things that you just wouldn't even believe. Um, they had a $2 million endowment, so you can take it from there. Um, it was really just, we were drawn together because we had to survive. And it turned out that I ended up breaking my engagement and I married the gentleman that was at Bryn Mawr. He was in the School of Social Work.
And his last name is Beckham?
No, Beecham is my married name. I'm sorry, my maiden name.
Okay.
Eventually, the gentleman I married and I got divorced. It was, my last name was Martin, and I went back to my maiden name Beecham. But we did have 2 sons. We divorced. We didn't have my first son until I'm sorry. We were married 5 years before we had my first son. And by the time we broke up, the younger one was only 18 months old. We had a second son. But we arranged to have shared custody of our sons. And it actually was an amazing thing to work. At first, I resented it. I think it was more punitive than anything, but it worked out. So from the time they were like 5 and a year and a half, they spent 2 weeks with me and 2 weeks with their father. And that went on back and forth until they both went to college. And the older son left for Morehouse in 94, and the younger one left for Morehouse in 97. And at that point, they could drive themselves to either house, but it was 2 weeks with him, 2 weeks with me. And I'm grateful that he was that involved in our sons' lives.
Nice,
That's
nice.
great. So Peggy, looking back, it's 66, or what is it, 50, 54 years ago?
Well, I'm thinking
That-
we would have been the 50-year class from Howard this year. We were all set to be at commencement and to participate.
Okay,
But
right,
because
that's
of
right.
the pandemic, we could not do that.
Look, what's your summing up statement? What, as you look back, what do you see, and what would you share with the generations that are coming behind you?
Okay. I am blessed to have had the opportunities that I had. It was something that took a village. I'm grateful to my family, my parents, my grandmother, and I talked a lot about her in my submission. My grandmother was just so determined to be the best she could be, and she wanted all of us to be the best we could be. My mother was an only child. And for all that my grandmother did, and I know for every time that I graduated or did something, I wanted my mom to be there. And it was just hard to imagine her not being there. She did pass away when my sons were young, but she did get to know them. But it takes that kind of support. The family structure is so important. And even from, quote, broken homes, as I came from a parents who divorced and later I divorced, there's still got to be that thread of cohesiveness and family, and certainly God in your life.
Peggy, thank you very much for joining this 12th edition of
And
What's
thank
on Jerome's Mind and the 1960s Project. I would welcome others who are listening to this to send their submissions to join in the project. You can either write a blog or come on as a video only guest, or do both. We're very much interested in your tiny thoughts and your large memories. And again, thank you Peggy for joining us.
Thank
and
you.
This
It was
is
a
Jerome
pleasure.
Page, and we can hope to see you again and hear from you as you continue to write that book that you're going to write about your life. Thanks
Thank
again.
you.
Bye-bye.
Everyone, please be safe, stay well. God bless you.
God bless you.
Okay. We don't have to hang up. I just had
Okay.
to close the show out. So if you have some questions for,
I have questions.
Yes, hello.
I have two questions. One, did you ever consider going for the PhD? And two, given your knowledge of how drugs are approved, what advice do you give us on the coronavirus
Wow.
vaccine?
Thinking I could even answer that. As far as a PhD, I did not consider it. When I was at Bryn Mawr, there was the offer, and I was very close to a young lady. We shared an office, and I'm still in touch with her. She did stay for her PhD. At that time, though, she had already worked for Merck and really was interested in getting back into academia. I had never really worked. I had come straight from Howard to Bryn Mawr. So the idea of considering continuing in a PhD program just didn't spark my interest then. So as I look back, maybe when I got to be 30 something, I thought, you know, you should have gone to medical school. And I had a friend who also started medical school that year. And I think had I really thought about it, I would have done that. Regarding this wonderful vaccine that everybody's all excited about, wow. I have mixed feelings. I am surprised that things have gone so quickly and so well with the Pfizer version and the Moderna version and the AstraZeneca, whatever. I think, though, they're going to have to really be careful about all the, to me, forced projections about how this is just going to get out there and we'll be back to normal, etc. I didn't work with vaccines, but I know that one major concern at least 20, 30 years ago was not just coming up with the original vaccine, but the ability to reproduce it. And unlike regular drugs, vaccines are licensed, and it's the manufacturing details that come with that license. A number of drugs have been made that were wonderful as vaccines, but the company could not reproduce that original batch to make it as effective and as safe. And you can't you can't sell that vaccine unless it matches what you had made before that was so well received. So I'm still waiting to see, you know, how much is there this political influence on how quickly this is being done? How quickly is the FDA going to do this? And the drug approval process has picked up. It's hugely, why did I say hugely? Faster than it used to be. It used to be 12 years before a drug could go from the clinical testing through approval. And every step along the way was necessary. That timeline was shortened, and it certainly with modern technology, you could do it. But I'm just still a little bit skeptical. I know 3 presidents have agreed to receive the vaccine. I want to see what happens to them. I hope nothing happens. I really do.
Plus, they got super. It's like if they get the virus.
Well, see, this is
they got the whole medical world at their
the same, right?
So
I want to hear what Dr. Fauci has to say.
Yeah.
And it's just to me a wait and see. I just pray that it will be as effective as they seem to think it's going to be.
I wonder also, I just heard today on the news that Pfizer was not able to produce or manufacture as many doses as they originally thought. So it sounds like one of your concerns is coming true already.
And that's interesting. You're right. When I heard that, I thought, okay, Pfizer has been an amazing company. I worked for 2 companies that Pfizer took over. So this was the era in the early 2000s when there were takeovers, mergers, and whenever a company mergers, there are 2 companies then that have people doing the same thing. Usually somebody has to go. And I managed to survive through 3 of those mergers, but I couldn't take it much longer. It was just too iffy. I just don't know what else to say about this whole vaccine business. But and also
let me bring David in here. David, I think you have somebody who can match you in terms of memory. I think you just got dethroned, brother.
I would say she has a great memory.
Don't ask me what I did with my keys 10 minutes ago. That's what really catches.
Oh, I know. Well, let me ask you.
Go ahead, David.
Short Story Club. Now, you mentioned O. Henry's famous Gift of the Magi.
Yes.
Did you also read The Ransom of Red Chief?
That sounds familiar.
That was about a bad kid in a Western town in the late 1800s, and a group of outlaws kidnapped him, and the town didn't mount a search or anything because Red Chief was so bad that they said they'll have to bring him back. And actually, the family required the kidnappers to pay a ransom to return Red Chief. So that was my second favorite story by O. Henry.
You know what? I need to check that out. It sounds
It's
wonderful.
hilarious.
Thank
It's
you.
hilarious. The Ransom of Red Chief.
Absolutely.
The Ransom of Red Chief.
Red
was looking
Chief.
for
Gotta
that
do that.
Yeah, you guys have the best memories and I have the worst. I barely remember at Emlyn Elementary School, but you, Miss Euthink, what you said was your teacher?
Unthank, Mrs. Unthank.
I think
She
I had
was my
her.
third grade
I
teacher.
think I had her too.
Okay. Yes. Mrs. Unthank was interesting.
Yeah.
Hey, Faye,
Yeah.
if you hang around
Oh, thank
Peggy long enough, you're going to remember.
I'm going to maybe be able to write something. Yeah, I don't remember.
To me, if you just you tap into it, and a lot of my friends say the same thing. How do you remember that? And I just say nowadays, I wish I wouldn't remember so much because it's crowding out information I really should know in today's world. Like I said, where are my keys or where is my phone? I know my phone's here because the light's still on, but I lay it down. I don't know where I left it.
Well, in my family, I'm known for not remembering things, and my sister seems to remember every single thing, as I mentioned to some of you before. But my philosophy is I remember what I need to know.
Exactly.
And my third grade teacher's name is not part of what I have ever needed to know in life.
It's only good for Jeopardy.
It's not even good for Jeopardy.
If you're not on the show, no.
Because they don't know the answer.
Let me ask a question before we close up.
Sure.
Close out. Now, Peggy's still finishing her blog. Any suggestions to her for finishing it up or any additions for those who had a chance to look at it?
Yes, of course. You've already stated that you sort of left us hanging because there was actually a subtitle for what was to come, but there was nothing below it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure that you will address that. And I would suggest that since you really stopped your essay in the 60s, that you just give a one paragraph summary of how your life evolved into where you are now.
Thank you.
Just one paragraph, I mean, because there was a lot up front, but you stopped in the 60s. Just like I stopped in 1979 on my essay. And then there was nothing about what I did after that. But just a one paragraph summary. And so all of this led me to be able to.
I appreciate that suggestion. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Faye, do you have any suggestions?
Me? No.
No, on the blog.
Oh, no, I just assumed she'd finish it. I mean, she left us hanging, but she knew she left us hanging. So it wasn't, it's not like she thought it had ended. So I think she's good.
Okay. Anybody else get a chance
we were in the same dorm.
At Wheatley.
We were both in Wheatley, yes, because I was an honor student as well.
Okay.
And my roommate was the editor of the Hilltop.
Oh, wow.
Adrian. Mm-hmm.
And goodness, I can see her name now. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. So I didn't stay there many years because my first year, although I was in the honors program, I was assigned to Crandall Hall.
Crandall, I was thinking of Crandall. Oh my goodness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I mean, Crandall was a good experience though.
Okay.
Because it was something unusual for me. There were 3 in a room.
That made it difficult. I know.
Yes, it was a developmental experience because I was used to sleeping 2 in a room.
Okay.
But the thing I remember about Crandall is that with that steam system, that steam plant at Howard, the rooms were always nice and toasty.
There you go.
And so I used to tell my father at Christmas time, I said, Daddy, I'm not going to come home unless you promise to keep the heat up at night.
There you go, bargaining.
Yeah, because that was a rule in our house that at night you turn the heat down to some
Yes.
ungodly temperature, and then you slept under all these blankets.
Okay.
And
Yes,
so, heaven forbid that you have to get up in the middle of the night.
that's it. Cold feet hit
But
the
I
floor.
told him, I said, Daddy, I'm used to sleeping in my summer pajamas all year round at Howard.
And it was that kind of heating thing. I don't remember ever having a problem with the heat in Wheatley, but we were comfortable. And I
Yes, the
think
whole
now,
campus was heated by its own steam plant.
but do you know about the horrible things that happened within the last 4 years, 3
Yeah,
years,
yeah.
when the boiler systems
Right.
all broke at the same time and they had to replace them and
Well,
didn't?
that's because there's one steam plant and it's feeding the whole campus.
And
the
it's
whole
been around
thing
for
blew up.
umpteen
Yeah, for
years.
100
Yes.
years.
Yes, yes,
Students couldn't even
yes.
go back after Christmas because there was no heat.
Mhm.
It was really unfortunate.
Yes, it was. But if you don't take care of it, it's like a car. If you don't take care of
There
it,
you
you may
go.
be out at 3 o'clock in the morning and it breaks down.
And even if you take care of a car, after a while, it'll just finally tell you enough.
Thank you. Nickel and dime you right on out of.
Yeah, time, even for a well-cared car at some point says enough.
Well, I guess I've never kept one long enough for it to
Well,
time out.
sure, that's true.
Timed out on somebody else.
That's true.
Well, thank you, everybody. I enjoyed this immensely, and Peggy will be in touch to try to wrap up your blog by Friday.
Uh-oh, thank you. I hear that deadline. What is today? It's Thursday. Wait a minute, that's tomorrow.
Yes, we can do this.
Okay, Dr. Page, I hear
We can do
you.
this.
Don't
We
worry,
can
it's
do
just
this.
one paragraph.
Yeah, that's all you need.
Well, yeah, but
Ending.
never mind.
Yeah.
My mind has been kind of, but this was such a pleasure. You made it very easy and fun. Jerome, you said it should be fun. And I felt very comfortable. As you know, I don't mind talking. So this worked out well, but thank you all for listening.
It was fascinating, just fascinating.
Thank you.
Wakanda forever.
What did you say? Oh, well,
Say
hey,
Wakanda forever.
I always say we gotta, absolutely. Oh my goodness. I did write something just about Chadwick Boseman's passing. And I just remember the shock to hear when he had passed away in August. And to see what he managed to accomplish. It's like, he served out his purpose, how he was here to do certain things, and he did them. But how courageous.
Well, we're looking for you to share that with our Thursday night chat group. Your writing on Chadwick Boseman.
That's just, no, well, and I won't talk too long. It was the idea, someone on Facebook had posted pictures of him just having lunch with friends when he was at Howard. And I started thinking about all the classmates and those 1 or 2 years ahead of me who became celebrities. And I start with Felicia Rashad, who was in my class, Debbie Allen.
Fertile ground. Yeah, it was fertile ground.
And to know you sat next to these people, you were students, you had the whole world ahead of you, and their trajectory just went, woo, okay. Donnie Hathaway, I used to listen to him sing with the Alphas every Friday.
Mhm.
Donnie was my homeboy.
Oh, wow,
He lived
okay.
in the dorm. I think I lived on the 4th floor of Drew Hall. He was a year ahead of me
Okay,
and of us. And he lived on the 3rd floor.
And he was from St. Louis?
He's from St. Louis, yeah.
Oh, no.
wow. David,
Donnie was the
Vicky
leader
Day.
of the Alpha Singers. And so when they gathered at the fountain on Fridays, the Alphas always sounded like a choir.
The Alphas were, we called them the choir boys. That's what they were.
Donnie Hathaway
were
was
fabulous.
the song leader. He was right in the middle, always.
Yeah.
Mhm. And I'll tell you one other thing that I remember about the Alphas. When the girls would be gathered in the cafeteria having dinner on Friday, the guys would come in and the Qs would come over to the table and they say, hey, you coming to our party Saturday night? The Alphas would come over and say, do you need a ride?
As I can drop.
I gotta go, y'all. I'm out.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.
Nice talking
Thank
to you.
you.
say thank you.
Bye-bye.
As an alpha would say, first of all, servants of all, we will transcend all. Ha!
All right. Good night, everybody.
Good
All
night.
right, good
Thanks
night. I
again.
enjoyed it. All right.